In one of the two videos for this lesson, we learned about some practices that make for effective studying. Now, in this tutorial, we'll dive into the details of one important aspect of study skills: how to schedule your studying. As we heard in the studying lecture, cramming works just fine if you only need to know something for a brief time, like if you'll be tested very soon after you study. But if you still want or need to know that material after you've been tested, like if you happen to enjoy the material and want to retain it, or to be more pragmatic, if the same topics will come up again on a final exam, if that's the case, then cramming is not the right approach. Instead, you should take advantage of the spacing effect, which is what scientists who study learning and memory have named the idea that adding breaks in between repeatedly studying the same or similar information ends up improving your long-term recall for that same information. We can't explain exactly why this works, but many scientists think that it has something to do with the forgetting that happens when you wait some time before coming back to something that you want to learn. It may seem counterintuitive, but this sort of forgetting, as long as it's eventually followed by relearning, does seem to be beneficial. But here's the key question: how long should you wait? As we heard in the lecture, the longer you wait, the greater the boost to retention that you'll get, generally speaking. But that's not quite the whole story. In the simplest case, describing the spacing effect requires 3 points in time. We've already covered study 1 and study 2, so what's the third? It's the future time when you expect to need to recall what you've learned. We'll call this point the test, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a written exam. It could be anything: a piano recital, public speaking engagement, or a trip to a foreign country whose language you've been studying. But let's use the example of an actual test. So, if you know that you'll need to remember what you've learned 2 weeks from now, say for a midterm exam, that places an upper bound on how long you can wait before restudying, namely 2 weeks. Even if waiting longer would provide more benefit to long-term retention, the immediate goal is to ace the upcoming midterm. So you should do what you can to optimize retention for that test. At the same time, you know you have a cumulative final coming in a couple months, which will include some of the same material as the midterm. So it's a good idea to do anything you can now to maximize what you can remember at the end of the term. One good thing to know about spacing is that research suggests that a little extra spacing goes a long way in terms of retention benefits. A useful principle seems to be that you should wait until you've almost, but not quite, forgotten what you've learned. The extra effort that you'll have to put into restudy when the material is not so familiar appears to be helpful for long-term memory. Now, everything so far assumes you won't get another chance to review after study 2. But remember what we said about cramming. It works well when you'll be tested right afterwards. So it's a good idea to get in a quick refresher the day before or the morning of the test. And of course, you'll also want to restudy at least one more time, plus a final refresher between that midterm and the final. This leads to some recommendations. Spread out your study as much as you can and give yourself a chance to refresh on the material right before you need to take the test. If you're giving yourself 6 hours total to study for that test in 2 weeks, an effective schedule might be something like 3 hours today, day 1, 2 hours on day 8 in about a week, and 1 hour review a day or two before the test. That way, you get the immediate benefit of spacing for the test, plus when it comes time to study for the final in 2 months, you'll remember much more than you would have if you'd crammed. Of course, you'll really want to plan another spaced study schedule to refresh for that final. So far, we've only talked about how to schedule study sessions. How about within each of those sessions? It's very likely each session contains more than just one fact, vocabulary term, or concept. How should you schedule your study of these items within a study session? The exact same principle applies. If you leave some time, even a few seconds or minutes, before reviewing material you've already covered, you'll improve your long-term memory for that material. There's even some evidence interleaving different study items like this, instead of just leaving empty space, provides an additional benefit over and above the spacing effect. Of course, This principle should also apply to scheduling study sessions. In the days between now and when you come back to restudy today's material, you should be moving on to spaced study of other topics. If this all seems pretty complex and difficult to implement, don't be too discouraged. There are actually software programs that can help. Just search online for terms like spaced repetition software or distributed practice software. Even something as simple as a calendar or planner can be of tremendous help in establishing a spaced routine. But remember that any spacing is better than no spacing, so even if you can't set up an optimized, perfect study routine, just remembering to come back and restudy what you've learned a couple days ago can be a huge help. Better yet, study by trying to recall what you learned from memory. As we learned in the last video, this type of active retrieval is much more effective than simply rereading notes or highlighting, and the benefit can stack on top of what you already get from spacing.